This is Alex, and welcome to Barely Braided, where we're taking a deep dive into foster care, adoption, and all things parenting, even the sticky stuff. Welcome to episode 22. I have so been looking forward to this episode because we have the pleasure of speaking with another wonderful and what I think is going to be a very beneficial guest today. I really have been looking forward to this. So Michelle from Hopeful Connections Parenting is a trauma-responsive parenting coach who works with foster and adoptive families. She has extra experience because she grew up with foster siblings and an adoptive sister, and her education is focused on child development and the belief in hope and healing that fuels her passion to bring these resources to foster and adoptive families. So big welcome to you, Michelle. I'm so excited that you're here. Thank you for agreeing to talk to us today.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, of course. So I would kind of like to start from the beginning, if you don't mind. What led to your work with foster and adoptive families? We talked a little bit about your upbringing. Can you tell us about that?
Sure. So I grew up in a home with foster siblings and, as you said, an adopted sister. There were a lot of kids for a lot of different lengths of time. This was in the 70s and 80s, so foster care, there weren't limits on how long a child could be in foster care, as there are now. So some were with us one night. I think the way I learned the definition for kleptomaniac was when I was little and someone stole my brother's Hot Wheel. And I was thinking that memory. Yeah, I was thinking about that memory today, and just that how much I was wired for this idea of like, wow, something must have happened that she did that, because I remember sitting in the backseat of the car thinking that. But there were also kids who stayed with us for 6 years. And I think of one little boy who would go back and forth to his dad. And my mom was able to be in a mentoring relationship with his dad, but he was in foster care for probably 6 years in our family. And his other sibling would come with him at times. But my sister is really different than many of the foster siblings that came. She came to us at 11 months of age from a history of severe neglect, and I would say from the professional side, probably now other likely abuses. And my parents were told at that time a good home, a good education, and a church would seal the deal. That would be enough for her. She'd be fine. She was 11 months old, and it shouldn't matter what happened to her. So she lived with us, and at 3, my parents were able to stop the advocate to stop the visits, and by 5, she was adopted. So she lived her life, though, really different than the rest of us who were biological siblings. And she had a lot of trauma, a lot of big extreme behaviors. So I went into college thinking, what made her so different than the rest of us who dealt with life's difficulties in many different ways than she did? So I went on and studied child development, and I focused really on the prevention of trauma without realizing how this was feeding this interest. And I worked in the hospital setting with kids and focused on child development and coping. But fast forward many years later, like 20-year gap there, and my own kids and my husband and graduate school. And I saw in my church that families were adopting and fostering, and while that was exciting, I hadn't seen the hope and healing that I believed play out in my own sister's life. But I wondered what could we do differently in these families that would provide stability, because I knew in the future there was the potential for families who had kids with big behaviors, marriages that were stressed because families didn't know what to do to bring healing to their children. So I knew that messy might be down the pipe. So I became good friends with someone who used trust-based relational intervention in their home. And as she used it, it was bringing hope and healing to her children. And it matched what I knew about child development. And I was excited about that. So my church families that I was working with sent me to Texas to learn about trust-based relational intervention. And from there, I built a ministry there, but the state started sending kids there with their foster families. And eventually, as my own families that I was serving in our church moved out of being able to attend because of those hard things hitting, I launched a business, Hopeful Connections Parenting, about 5.5 years ago.
Wow, that is so interesting. And a few things that you said kind of jumped out at me. The first, not really a question, more of a comment, but I didn't realize that years ago, foster placements could last so long. I know now there's kind of a push for permanency quickly, and of course, not to step over any of the rules or any of the restrictions or what's best for that child. But I am just kind of stunned that foster children could be in a family for many, many, many years before they saw permanency. That's crazy to me.
Yeah, that was really, I'm trying to remember what president made a national push for 18 months being about the time where, right, like those steps had to be taken. So there's some national standards we have now that, this is my understanding, there's some national standards we have now that drive that. And those are still changing, right? And our states have different priorities as far as getting the child back to the bio family versus being adopted, and the different priorities states put on that. But there needs to be a plan much quicker than there used to be. I mean, even my sister's case, 5 years before she was adopted.
Wow. Yeah. And as difficult as that may be for the children, which is kind of obvious, it's also, I'm assuming, very, very difficult for the foster families and the foster parents and the foster siblings as well to kind of just not really know exactly what permanency for that child looks like. I can imagine that would be a huge strain on a foster family.
Yeah, I should ask my mom that. I only have the child perspective, right, of this one particular boy who was with us for so long and coming back and forth. So I don't know what the adult perspective of fostering like that was compared to now.
Okay. So you talked about TBRI. That is an acronym that I've heard. I have to admit, I'm not incredibly familiar with it, but I know it's something that you hear about from time to time in the foster care or the adoption world. So can you explain that to us?
Yes. Trust-based relational intervention, or TBRI, is a emerging model for a wide range of behavioral problems. It's been mostly applied to the foster and adoptive world, and a lot of the resources focus on that population. It's often used when other interventions have failed, but I would say it should be our first line of defense. And I would say it applies to all relationships because it's a relational-based intervention. And it's based on neurodevelopmental theory. It's well-researched and very, from my perspective, very love and we're created for this connection. And that's really the basis for TBRI. So it's about caregivers providing a intervention that's relational and healing relationships, because so many of the kids come to us, obviously, with these hurts that are about broken relationships. And so TBRI provides a way to navigate that for parents and tools to learn about how to bring healing to their children. And honestly, it's changed the way we have parented our own children in our home that are not from foster and adoption.
Okay, so the program, this is a formal training that you receive. Is that right? And there's like a TBRI certification, or what do the logistics look like?
Sure. So I am a TBRI educator. I've gone through training and can provide the caregiver training, or I also use it in my business for coaching. But as a parent, you can access that information in a lot of different ways. There are endless amounts of YouTube videos in the Karen Purvis Institute of Child Development YouTube channel. They have resources for learning on your own, and there are other TBRI trainers and educators throughout the world, actually, that provide training in different capacities. So some might be using it in their organizations. We have people in the Department of Health and Welfare here in Idaho who have been trained. There are a lot of different ways that TBRI is applied. But for parents to learn, it's a self-learning journey, or you can invite someone else finding classes and things like that. If I were new at the process, I might go on the Karen Purvis Institute website and look for the practitioner list and find out locally if there is anyone. And then, like myself, I work nationally. So is there someone who could come alongside me to learn that journey?
I know a majority of my listeners are either new or prospective foster or adoptive parents. And from what I've gathered, most of my listeners are massive researchers and they just really love consuming as much information as they can prior to their journey or in the beginning of their journey. So if you don't mind, after we are finished recording, I'm going to have you send me those links and some resources that you think would be helpful, and then we can post them in the description of this podcast.
Perfect.
I think that will be really helpful. So let's talk about trauma a little bit. I know in the foster parent training and sometimes in the adoption training, we receive some classes or some information on the best ways to parent children who have experienced trauma. How does trauma affect the brain of a child?
So this is the part that I just love teaching about. So
well, good. We love.
I'm going to try not to go on too many tangents myself. So, so let's look at a few different ways. So if you ran into a bear in the forest, let's think of some ways that you might respond. I live in Idaho, so I guess that's a more likely question I use with parents. But anyways, pretend.
Okay. Well, I will tell you a little, kind of similarly, in our rental home in Deadwood, South Dakota, we recently caught a mountain lion on our camera. So can we pretend it's a mountain lion?
Okay, let's pretend it's a mountain lion. Perfect.
Perfect.
So you go outside, you see a mountain lion. What are your responses, or your kids' responses? Like, what happens?
Maybe a few things: freeze, shock, scream, run. I think, without that actually happening, that's what I would assume.
Right. Your heart might start racing. Mm-hmm. Your hands might start sweating. Your adrenaline would spike.
Yes.
Your eyes would dilate. Things would happen that you have no control over.
Yes.
Right? A lot of children live like that constantly. That fight, flight, and freeze is a way our bodies are wired to save us from the mountain lion. And so when a child is exposed often to those types of experiences that cause our body to react that way, their amygdala, which is the part of our brain that's in charge of the fight, flight, and freeze, that amygdala is going to be overdeveloped. So you have a kid living with you who always has a mountain lion in the room.
Wow.
And so if we think of that, now this isn't true of every child who walks through our door who's foster and adopted, right? So I recognize that, but I work with the families whose kids are living with mountain lions. So if we think about that and think about their brains being different, and we start looking for clues about when their jaw is clenched and their eyes are dilated and their palms are sweaty, we might get clues that they don't even know about. But when we send them to school and they're on the playground causes our hands to sweat, our heart to race. There's a lot of screaming. There's a lot of excitement. Those are the same body responses as a bear, right? Or as a mountain lion.
Wow.
You and I know the difference when we go for a run and then come back and our heart is racing. But a child who's not had the opportunity to learn what it is to calm down and to learn what safety is, those might be triggering events where their body is saying, you need to panic. And so when they come back in, they're not sitting down to do math, right? They're not kindly walking in a line. They're ready for fight, flight, and freeze. So we need to just know that their brains are wired differently. Our brains can develop and change, and that's the beauty of healing.
So some of those signs that you mentioned, the eyes dilating, I had no idea that could be a sign, or more obvious signs, let's say that a parent may recognize. We will physically pick up on those cues. Is that right? You
can. I mean, I think at times you can. Some kids have learned really to mask those, right? To not let you know that. But if we look at babies, and the research has been done that some of those calm babies, when you drop them off in the nursery and then go off to our exercise class and come back, and you're like, that's the kid I want. That kid didn't cry. Sometimes, not all of those babies, but some of those babies are that way because they've already learned to hide it. So when we test their urine, their cortisol is actually higher. The stress hormone is actually higher. So they're still living in stress. Their brain is still responding. So we can't just look at that, but I tell parents, like, there are clues that our children give us that we need to know that calm children who know how to behave do behave. Like there's something going in the brain often. So that's an important piece. But there are clues, like thinking about, okay, what are those sweaty palms when you hold their hands? What's going on?
Wow. Okay. So as a parent, if I were to notice some of those signs in a child that I'm parenting, what are some ways that I can help calm them or make them feel better? Are there ways for me to help?
Sure. When we have relational trauma, we can provide healing through relationships. And I think most of the foster and adoptive kids who come to us are going to have some level of relational trauma. Even a parent who adopts a newborn, there's potential there for relational trauma. There is connection in utero. So again, I'm not saying every child who's adopted or every foster kid who walks through your doors, but there's that potential. So I love teaching ways of ways we can calm the brain. Some of these are coping strategies and some of them are relational strategies, right? So for example, coping. We can use the brain, knowing that the brain, there's a right side and a left side that feeds into how we think and process information. We can give kids, I'd say we should give these to adults too. You can use these too to calm down in the moment when you're in the fight, flight, and freeze of
that was my next question.
Some kid just triggered you, then these are good tools for that too.
All right, I'm on board. I'm ready for this.
So the right hand is connected to the left brain. The left hand is connected to the right brain. And so if we alternate squeezing right hand, left hand, left hand, calmly in a rhythmic pattern, that actually feeds into our brain calming down. Because if we can get both sides of the brain engaged, it calms down our brain. It calms down our body and tells our body we're safe. I actually used to teach that one to my own kiddos, and my daughter had a lot of dental work as a child. And so she would do that for me whilst they were, giving her the medicine to numb her little mouth. But you could see her as she became dysregulated, you could see the rhythm stop, right? Like she would do right, left, right. She couldn't keep a steady rhythm when the pain got too much and she was moving to that amygdala back of the brain response. So I would hold her hands and squeeze right, left to try and help her brain calm down. So that right, left input. So other things we do like biking and walking, and there's a lot of right, left body movements we do that can calm us down.
So I know I'm not the only person that is like sitting at a desk or at our computer squeezing their hands one after the other. I just need to make sure I'm doing this right. So is it like you squeeze your right hand into a fist and then your left hand?
Yes. And then release, open, shut.
Wow.
Open, shut. So awesome. You're going back and forth, right? And you're using both sides of your body. So understanding the brain and learning about how the brain works is a great way to give coping to children. And the other piece of that, as far as helping kids calm, is that relational piece. We give so many messages through our expression, because of all that automatic response that we have to the mountain lion. We give so many messages in the moment, right? If you're in a close relationship, the person barely needs to flinch and you're like, wait a minute, why are you reacting that way, right? Because we get in sync with the other person. So if we can provide the moments where we're giving that calm and teaching the child to, when they escalate, to give calm, that brings healing to the brain also.
This is so interesting. I saw something, and I want to ask you about this because I had never heard of this before. And full disclaimer, I saw this on TikTok last night. So that shows you about how legitimate it could be. But I had never heard of this before. And it was a video called, I think it was called 8D audio. And basically it was an audio clip that you were supposed to listen to with like headphones or earbuds. And it started like kind of just like a normal song would. And then all of a sudden like this beat dropped and it became like fully immersive, and the sound just it seemed like it just spread across your whole body. And I was reading through the comments and these people were saying like, this is helpful for certain like anxiety reduction and depression reduction. And I was just curious, have you ever heard of anything like that when it comes to like audio?
Yes.
Oh, you have?
Yes. So again, this is brain. So we have, I'm going to try and simplify this really. I haven't had to explain this in such a simplified way, but so we have our body in these responses, and there are nerves in our body and systems in our body that are connected also to our ear, that's to our brain, to our heart, to our brain, that tell us how to calm. And that makes sense because we just talked about all these different systems that respond and to that mountain lion, right? So one of the ways we can tap into the brain is through the ear. And so I have provided something called actually the Safe and Sound Protocol. And that's a great way to build up a regulation, a skill to regulate, because we access the nerve in the ear to calm down the body and train the body what calm is. So for the Safe and Sound Protocol, you use, I'm trying to remember the number of how you can break it down into tiny parts. I mean, you can break it down into 10-minute segments. So I'm not going to give a number of times we use it, but you have a headset on and you listen to music. And when I did it, it fades in and out because it has to do with the frequency of the noise. And so when you listen to this music, the music is fading in and out. And if you're sensitive to sound, it's actually very annoying, I think. Like I had trouble listening and engaging. And you're supposed to be doing something calm. So, I'm thinking, I'll do this for the kids so I can understand. So I'm trying to use, an adult coloring book, which I never sit still long enough to do that. I'm listening to this music that's fading in and out. I'm thinking, I'm having to work on regulating just to listen. But it does provide this course where you go through, or this protocol where you go through and are able to train that nerve. And so oftentimes what we'll do is we'll have a parent and a child have a jack that splits the sound for two different headsets. And then they can both listen to this and go through the protocol together. And the reason I'm navigating how I say this is Safe and Sound has just changed the way they do this. It used to be that I had to send the entire listening unit to a family, but now it's actually accessible through a subscription on your phone. So that's why I was navigating that. And how do I say this? But that's a really interesting option, right? To do something as simple as this, playing Legos with your child while listening to something. You get the play in, which provides calm. You get in regulation and safety of relationship. And you're just passively listening to Disney music. Because the music is actually not that advanced. It's Disney songs, right?
Yeah, that is so interesting. I love that. So if we had a parent, let's say, that wanted to learn more about that protocol, would it be okay if they reached out to you, or
Absolutely.
If they wanted to hire you through your website? Is that something that you're available for?
Absolutely. We'll just have the email available and my website available. My website's simple because it's hopeparenting.com, but we can do that. And reaching out to me is the best way to do that.
Perfect. Okay. So I'm going to repeat that, hopeparenting.com. And then I'm also going to have that in the description of the podcast. So that way listeners can visit your website as well. Okay. So I know you talked about adoption in and of itself could be a source for trauma. Can you elaborate on that? Because that's particularly interesting to me. Our son was adopted. We've had him in our home since birth. And so I'm kind of having trouble figuring out if that's something I may need to navigate in the future.
Well, this is the thing is, it potentially could be, right? But break in relationship is always a trauma. So it depends on so many factors that we don't completely have captured on what that in utero experience was like, right? Let's get my own story. With my first child, I was going through grad school. We moved, 4 times in order to get between graduation and buying our first home. We only had a 2-seater car and a motorcycle, so we had to figure out how to get a car as well. I had a publication deadline for my thesis 6 weeks after his due date.
Oh my goodness.
I can, right? I can keep going. Those are really happy things. None of those were oh, this is terrible. They were all things of wow, this is what we've been working towards, right? We have a job. We're real people and we're having a baby. And those are beautiful things, but that's a lot of cortisol. That's a lot dumping on his brain. And those are good things, right? So you can imagine that any mom who provides this beautiful place to grow has some level of stress, and how that impacts the brain, when it impacts the brain, all unfolds differently. No one told me that. So I had a kiddo born with a lot of cortisol in his brain, and no one said the reason he is so fussy is, right? Instead, I thought it was me. So I say all that because it's really important to realize that those things we don't even realize, whether it's birth parents or adoptive parents or foster parents, things happen that we don't know, and we need to provide a safe relationship for healing.
Okay. Interesting. So what are, let's say, for example, I am a foster parent and I have children in and out of my home that may or may not have experienced various levels of trauma in their lives. Some, it sounds like I may be able to identify when that happens, and others may be better at hiding it. What are some practical, everyday things we can implement in our family to make that child more comfortable or to help him or her heal?
So I think routine is really important. I think providing the structure and letting them know what's going on, understanding that there's a need behind the behaviors, right? That children, for example, children who are hoarding food, there's a reason they're doing that. It's not a child who's being a thief, right? It's a child who may have experienced not having food and isn't sure when they're going to get it next. Even though you tell them they're safe, that doesn't mean their body's not saying there's a mountain lion and they need to hoard, right? So understanding that there's a need behind the behavior and being a detective to figure that out is a great way to deal with those behaviors. As far as like creating a safe environment, routines, knowing what to expect. And I think offering compassion is really a piece of all those.
I'm glad you kind of addressed that, because one of the questions that I thought was really important to ask you was, and you kind of touched on this, is it important to determine where negative behaviors stem from, or to determine if negative behaviors have come from trauma, or if they may just be a behavior that the child has because the child is unruly? I don't know. Maybe that's not the politically correct way to say it, but do we need to determine the root of those behaviors?
So I would say yes and. And here's what I mean by yes and. So let's just take me in the grocery store, 5 o'clock, I finished work, pick up the kids from daycare, and we're standing in line because I forgot we don't have meat for tonight. So we're standing in line. For the third time, someone asked me for the Tic Tacs, and I lose my cool, right? The need behind the behavior, right? Like there's a need behind that behavior. I wasn't regulated. I'm hungry. There's a lot of stuff going on. If we can have compassion for other people, that there's usually a need behind the behavior. People, and I would say children, are not out just to do bad, right? Right. I believe in the nature that sure, things go offline here, but kids aren't out to do wrong. They're not out to steal and trick and lie. Those things happen though, because there's something behind it. So if we can have compassion and then we can meet that need, it really helps. And for me, understanding, as a foster parent, you don't always get to do this, but understanding history helps, right? It helps to have compassion. It helps us to understand what's going on, and it helps us to figure out how to meet that need. So I think that for kiddos who you're only having in your home for a week or 6 months, understanding that those little behaviors that are difficult, there really is something behind it, is really important for helping us parent.
I love that answer. It's something that I think is easy to overlook or easy to forget as a parent when your child is, let's say, I don't know, banging on the TV or screaming and crying, that the child's intentions are not to irritate you. The child's intentions are to meet some sort of need. And I think that's so important to reiterate and to remember. I love that answer. Thank you.
And likewise, why is the banging on the wall bothering me? Like, what's my need there that I have, that piece is causing my own mountain lion experience?
That's so interesting. So I'm going to kind of break off into another little tangent. And this, again, is kind of for my own personal curiosity. But because I'm a parent of foster or adopted children, it is quite often that I find myself in a situation, let's say, for example, I'm at the park with my foster children or my adopted children and my adult friends who are also parents, and they pick up on, let's say, a negative behavior from one of my children and begin to give this unsolicited parenting advice, which I know is something that all moms probably experience. But the difference is that maybe they might not be familiar with the fact that their could have possibly been more trauma in the lives of the children that I'm parenting. Is there an appropriate way to address that with like my friends or my family, for example, who may give this unsolicited parenting advice, but they don't have the experience in trauma parenting? I know that was like kind of a very long-winded way to ask that question, but does that make sense?
Yes, it does. I have to laugh at that question just because I think unsolicited advice is called criticism.
Oh, yep.
Right? Like if you didn't ask for it, no, you probably didn't need it.
Yes, correct.
But lots of people do, right? Like we do live with that, hey, can I give you an idea? Wow, he sure hits hard. Let me tell you how to solve that problem.
Yes.
But I think as parents dive into that journey and figuring out who they need to give what information is tricky to navigate, right? So being able to say to one mom on the playground, yeah, he has some hard things, or, I mean, assuming they know this is a kid who wasn't with you 2 weeks ago, but suddenly is with you, right? Like,
right.
And I think just saying thanks, he has some hard things. And then realizing, again, I go back to realizing, why does that make me think that I need to value that, or that they need to know, right? Like what's going on in my own brain? What's the piece? And I'll tell you for my own story, it would have been, I didn't want the criticism of my parenting because I value what I do so highly of parenting that I wouldn't want someone to be criticizing me. And so that would be what I had to deal with in my own head. But I think that finding out the level of what they actually need to know. So the person who's with you at the park every week and meeting you every Thursday, they may begin to discover that this is a repeated behavior and say something, and you may need to say, hey, he's got some big things, so we navigate this differently. If they want to know more, they'll ask, right? Like, but having resources on hand, like, and again, you asked for we'll put these in the end, but the connected child or the connected parent, because I really think that the TBRI resources change parenting typical kids too. So I think they're beautiful resources to hand off.
Absolutely.
But it's hard to navigate those parents who tell you. And I did have that because my firstborn was fussy. So lots of people told me how to parent and stop that and let him cry it out or whatever the method was, right? And I remember when he was 1, someone turning to me and going, wow, what did you do differently that you changed your parenting so much that he stopped crying? And it was that he started walking that week. He just was on the move from the moment he was born. So anyways, just one of those things you're like, nothing. It wasn't all about me, actually.
Yes. Well, and don't get me wrong, too. Sometimes I'll be in a situation and one of my friends will say, hey, I don't know if you're aware of this, but my son had the same behaviors and I tried this and it really worked. Mm-hmm. Might be worth a shot. And of course, that's always appreciated. But I think sometimes the delivery can impact how the message is perceived. And so I remember I was out with some friends the other night and one of them, somebody who's more of an acquaintance, said, well, you just need to get in and whap his butt and blah, blah, blah. And half of the time they don't realize that, foster children, first of all, cannot endure any physical abuse. That's what we signed up for. And we agreed, that's not allowed in our world. But sometimes you don't want to get into those details and maybe you disagree with what they're saying. And there may just not be an easy way to nicely handle it other than saying, okay, thank you, move on, change the subject.
Yes, you're right. And it's hard. I think that figuring out navigating how much is that person going to be involved in your world, and are they willing to discover other options, right? And to understand your own story too, right? So I think that's the important part too. How much information you give them.
Yes, yes. And you mentioned The Connected Child, which is a book that we were required to read prior to our adoption. I don't think it was a requirement of foster care, but it was a requirement for our adoption to be finalized. But you also said The Connected Parent, and I had not heard of that. Is that a second series or a second?
Yes.
Okay.
It's brand new, actually. And
oh, wow.
So Dr. Purvis, and Dr. Cross are the 2 primary researchers for TBRI. And Dr. Purvis died in spring of 2016. And she had begun a book with someone, and Lisa Qualls just published that book as a co-author with Purvis.
Wonderful.
Yeah, it's a great resource.
Yes, I'm going to have to check that one out too, because I really enjoyed The Connected Child, and it seems like it's kind of a staple for foster and adoptive families.
Yes, and it's the basis of TBRI. That really is the introduction place.
Okay. So similarly to the unsolicited parenting advice thing, kind of, if you are parenting children who may or may not have experienced trauma, but they're temporarily in the care of someone else. So let's say a family member is babysitting or a daycare. What do you think it's important to talk about with those caregivers that could be different from when they care for children who have not experienced that kind of trauma?
So I think this is so tricky to navigate, isn't it? Because some people are willing to try parenting different. Some people have successfully raised kids and or worked with children, and traditional methods have worked because they had more margin, right? They were able to, in my case, in that example with my son, they were able to let their kiddo cry it out and there were no ramifications. But for a kid who's had trauma and has had to cry themselves to sleep, that's not the best option for their little brain. So if it's family and or even a babysitter or daycare and they're regularly providing that care, I think asking for some traditions in that drop-off procedure and some ways to navigate that is really important. If they're open to learning about TBRI and trauma responsive parenting, putting resources in their hand and helping them understand how brains are wired is important. Just like I gave that example of the right-left hand, and I wouldn't let someone else go to an appointment with my daughter without knowing that, right? Like helping them understand who she is. So I think those coping strategies of this is how they calm, but I think putting the resources in the hands of people of this is how trauma impacts the brain, like The Connected Child, or there's a lot of on the Karen Purvis YouTube channel, there's also a lot of 2-minute videos on attachment, on TBRI, on different resources. And so for those people who only have the 2 minutes and can get a quick overview, it may be enough to spark an interest. I think things like dropping off at daycare, we can put rituals in place that help kids. So for example, one thing I think is a great way to help a kid who needs to learn that the foster parent will provide what they need is when I drop off my child, you ask me, can I give little Johnny a hug if he needs to be comforted? Because comforting is something a parent can do to calm a child, and that's in relationship, right? And so can I give Johnny a hug and comfort him until you return? And of course you can. And then asking, well, can I give Johnny the food he needs until you return and so that I can meet those needs? Of course you can. So handing off those responsibilities of the job and letting the child hear that. So adding those types of rituals that assure your child you're providing that care helps the child stay calm. The caregiver providing those resources of what you're learning about the child in ways that work are really important. Finding environments where people are willing to learn about the impact of trauma can be really tricky, and helping the child learn about their own, obviously I'm not talking about infants, but helping a child learn about their own responses and the way their body responds is equally important. Like the food response, right? And hoarding and helping a child saying, I noticed you really sneak this food, not asking, but telling them, I noticed that you like to take food up to your room and hide all the trash. I know your body hasn't always had the food it needs. I'm going to provide that. Let's figure this out together. Might mean that they go to daycare with a fanny pack and we figure out what that means at daycare, right?
Yes, very interesting. Another thing that kind of popped into my mind as you were talking about the different ways to comfort children when they may need it is I recently heard about, I think it was a book or maybe it was a video on the love languages of children and how different children may prefer to be shown love or comfort in different ways. So just like adults, some of them may really enjoy quality time together or gifts or whatever it may be. Are there ways to show different children comfort and care based on their own love languages? Do they prefer different things based on the child?
Well, I think that has to do with how our brain is wired in those early attachments. If you were to look at the attachment of my grandmother without meeting my mom, you would find out how my mom attached to me. It's generational unless we work on our own junk. And how we attach in those early 1 to 3 years, how we learn to do a relationship really will influence and direct the path of how we navigate relationships for the rest of our life, because that's how our brain is wired. We can change that by what I would say fiercely working on our own stuff, but our brains are wired for ways to interact. So I think we do learn how to understand and interpret relationships, love in different ways, right? And because of those early relationships. So I do think there's different ways. I think working on our own attachment and understanding what attachment looks like and how that influences the development of the brain is a great way to figure out what the needs are behind those behaviors and then create safety. Because if they're living with a mountain lion in the room, even if they are safe, even if you have the food, you have a safe place to sleep, you have a, safe environment in your home, that child doesn't know they're safe. So felt safety is really about their body calming down. And it takes a while for that to happen for some children.
Very, very interesting. Tell us about your website. Tell us about Hopeful Connections Parenting and the services that you offer to parents.
Sure. So I provide the TBRI caregiver training to foster and adoptive parents. I also work with churches and school and residential facilities, and I provide parent coaching to those who already have had some exposure to TBRI, and I combine those to packages for parents to really integrate it into their homes and figure out how they're going to do this. Because this is what I found is you can look at all the 3-minute YouTube videos, or you can dive into all the videos that TCU has. That's the university that has done all the research, all those videos that they provide for parents and go through their training. And I highly recommend all that. But the truth is when you have a child who's repeatedly hoarding food or extreme behaviors, putting it into action what I say to parents is putting it into action when the fist is being thrown is really tricky. And having someone come alongside you is really helpful. So I provide coaching to parents as we brainstorm, how does this apply in their own families and how can they make it work? So I have been providing this on Zoom for a while now because I already had made that pivot before we all went on Zoom. Mm-hmm. and so it works well. And I've worked with other states to provide foster parents with training and coaching. So it really depends on what resources and how the funding works in individual states and figuring that out. So my website, hopeparenting.com, has some resources and has a great 5 days of play. And I've got coping strategies in there, like that right left hand idea. And so you can just jump on my website and get on that list. It's right at the top for that resource and it'll come to your inbox. Also, Michelle at hopeparenting.com is a great way to contact me. And then we can talk about what does it look like to navigate in your state. And honestly, I do this. I've worked with Washington and I worked with someone on the East Coast. So I have to figure out how do you work in your state, but together we can navigate that and figure out what that means. So
that's amazing. So is there a best time to contact you? And what I mean by that, I can think of a ton of questions that I have for you. And if I was wanting parenting advice or coaching, my children are just babies. And in my head, I'm kind of thinking, well, are they too young for me to start implementing your help and your advice? Or is any age of your children appropriate for a time to reach out to you?
I wish that I had understood TBRI earlier. And this is why, is because I wish I had gotten the reason my son was fussing and the needs behind that and the way his brain was wired differently, because it would have influenced my parenting. I also think that TBRI influences other relationships. And I say to moms, it's good to carry this into other relationships. It's probably wise not to say to your spouse, will you say that again with respect? But it's a good practice for both people to say, can I have a chance to try that again? Right? Like those are good relationship principles. So I think TBRI brings healing to relationships in general. So I think diving in for a parent and figuring out when they decide they need help is a good time to call me, right? That depends. Some people read these resources and navigate this for a long time, and they're not going to have the bumps in the road because they've already begun that journey of their own healing and figuring out why they're reacting to certain things and have the bandwidth to do that. Other families are going to find that they have a fussy toddler and extreme behaviors and they're not quite sure what to do and maybe they want more help. So
love that. Absolutely love that. So as a reminder, I will link up your website in the podcast comments and then also on my social media so listeners can find that. And I really, really appreciate the hand squeezing thing is going to be life-changing for me. I know I can sense it. I've done it through the entire podcast and I know that's going to be my new thing. So I would just love to jump on your website, talk more with you about other techniques that we can implement. So I definitely plan on doing that. And if guests have a specific question for you, maybe about their own scenario or their own family, is the best way for them to contact you to start at your website?
Yes. Or you can email me, Michelle@hopeparenting.com.
Awesome. Thank you so, so much. Before we wrap up, I do need to give a big, big thanks, as always, to our podcast editor, Ruben. He is my lifesaver and my time saver, and he's such a big help. And then, of course, Michelle, huge thanks to you. The services you provide seem to be so incredibly beneficial and helpful for foster parents, adoptive parents, parents in general. So thank you so much for the information that you gave us today. Thank you for talking to me.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here. It's fun to chat about these things that I get excited about.
Yes, it absolutely is. Have a wonderful day, and we will talk to you soon.
All right. Thank you.